Mukesh Kapila is Professor of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester. He's also Special Representative of the Aegis Trust for the Prevention of Crimes Against Humanity and Chair of the Minority Rights Group International. Previously, he was Under Secretary General at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Earlier, he served the United Nations in different roles as Special Advisor to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, and then Special Advisor at the UN mission in Afghanistan. Subsequently, he led the UN's largest country mission at the time as the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for the Sudan, and then became a director at the World Health Organization. He also helped set up the UK's first national HIV and AIDS program at the Health Education Authority, becoming its deputy director. In 2003, he was honored by Queen Elizabeth and named a Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his international service. In 2007, he received the Global Citizenship Award of the Institute for Global Leadership. And his book, Against the Tide of Evil, published by Mainstream Random House Group, was released in March 2013. So I'd like to welcome our guest, Professor Kapila.
Thank you very much indeed. You shouldn't believe all it says in bios. I was talking to someone, a staff member, and they were being very critical of their job. So, we were having this kind of argument about this, and I said to her, well, you're very kind of obviously not very happy. But when I look at your job application for the job she was applying for, she was talking about wonderful things about what she had achieved and what she had done in the organization. So that's just a little side story about institutions and such like, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I think before more ado, let's have a short film, because as they say, pictures speak louder than words. So please go ahead. Some of you may have already seen this off of my website, but most people will not have. And if you're tweeting, please tweet lots without paying attention. My Twitter name is just my name, @Mukesh Kapila, and this is @LostandFound. Go ahead. Here we are, just 30 minutes away from the government base in Kadugli. This is how they live. The little children, their mothers, hiding in a cave which is no more than a meter in depth, month after month now, for 2 years. What a way of living. It is disgraceful that civilians like this, women and children, 90% of the people you've seen here are women and children, should be bombed from the skies, missiled, their fields burnt, their homes destroyed, their food stocks completely gone, and unable to grow their crops, season after season after season. These are crimes against humanity. These are war crimes. And I don't know why the world isn't doing more about it.
ده كلام الحقيقي، ده كلام الحقيقي اللي جعل المواطنين لفرار ايضا يدوم لهم الانشدال. ده الكلام انا قلته هو كلام صحيح.
We are in Tabania, going to see a bombed area where the houses were destroyed and people killed. I hope we can talk to some survivors there. So you have seen the bombing take place?
والله حصل شفنا بس بيت هرقت ضرب 5 مرات.
Al-Bashir, the president, the defense minister, and the governor of southern Kordofan, Ahmed Haroun, have already been indicted by the International Criminal Court for what they did in Darfur. And here they are doing exactly the same things, if not worse, here in the Nuba Mountains, and you can see that their handicraft.
He was just playing with his brother, and then he got injured.
A lot of wounds from the Antonov bombardments. The vast majority of these are civilian. These Antonov wounds tend to be very severe. Loss of limb, of course, loss of life. Very deep penetrating wounds, this type. In addition to the traumatic wounds caused by outright fighting, there's been a large increase in cases of malnutrition. For sure, a lot of the problems, certainly problems with hunger, the problems with supplies will be lessened if they allow these cross-border operations to take place. Just humanitarian aid across the border. Personally, I'm puzzled why this is not taking place. It doesn't make any sense to me. We have hungry people. We see hungry people here. Let's do the right thing and provide food to the hungry people. And don't worry about what the Khartoum government says. The Khartoum government will renege on any agreement that is made with them.
To deny life-saving humanitarian aid and medical assistance to non-combatants, wounded, which by definition are therefore non-combatant, isn't that a violation of international humanitarian law and a crime against humanity?
Yes, it is. So the international community has been complicit in the Khartoum government's program to annihilate the people here.
This thin blue line is the disputed boundary between Sudan behind me, that is the Nuba Mountains, and in front of me is the Republic of South Sudan. This thin blue line here is where the rhetoric meets reality. And I would like to invite all the people to come and visit and see for themselves what the human cost is of not only their inattention and inaction, but also their misconceived policies, which actually make the suffering worse. So the international community, the African Union, the United Nations, that has invested so much in the peace process between Sudan and South Sudan, must realize that all their efforts are in vain if they continue to neglect the people of the Nuba Mountains.
They're raping for women. This is started in Sudan where the war started. Where that Sharia is talking about that? No Sharia like that.
This is Yabus in Blue Nile State in Sudan. At the New Year, as Sudan celebrated its Independence Day, and President Bashir himself celebrated in Damzin, the state capital, he sent his Antonovs to raise this neighborhood to the ground. This was an important market town. Markets happen here, there's schools, there's clinics, there's little businesses, and all that was destroyed at the turn of the New Year. A Happy New Year gift from the President of Sudan to his people.
Tarap el melun ko sari tuatani kan arka timu ta ka tene kan ko sari ka timu up yani ki yolu pela tuma arka puru moto arka to tiu ya puru tas ka tene bidi ko sari tuatan.
This is a mass grave of about a dozen people. On a clear, sunny day, February the 20th, 2012, there was a marketplace here, and the people going about their business could not hear the Antonov that came rumbling in.
أنا بفكر وترى أقوم بيتانا من أقوله أقوم بيتانا ما بيعمل لنا حاجة لكن ترى قاعد بيعمل وبدقون أي وما عندنا فرصة نينا الناس مساكين ما في حاجة في يد أنا ما بعرفه طبعا أنا زول مواطن وما بعرفه حاجة.
So we are in the vastness of northern Baragazal state of South Sudan. The conflict between Sudan and South Sudan has led to a highly militarized border just a few kilometers north of us. There can be no peace and stability across these two countries unless some of those border and other issues are resolved. So here we have another crater, bomb sent by Antonovs of Sudan Air Force, and you can see behind me the civilian village, which is so close, and it's a miracle that only 5 people died here. But this is one of many such bomb attacks in this neighborhood. So this is the last day of our 10-day pilgrimage through the borderlands of Sudan. We've been to the Nuba Mountains, we've been up Blue Nile State, and we have traveled to the very border of Darfur. All these areas have one thing in common. Bashir's tactics are brilliantly simple. First, he attacks his citizens, the civilians, drives them off their land. Once they have fled, then his own people, the Arab tribes, come in and claim the empty land as their own. And what the international community aid efforts is doing is actually bolstering this strategy by not allowing people to remain where they are, join hands, employing the new technologies of communication and ideas, and help to sweep the genocidal regime of the land. So, I'd like to tell you a story. And you think I'm going to talk to you this evening. What you don't realize is that actually you're going to talk to me. So stay alert, because you might be asked any moment. Ten years ago, I was asked to become the head of the United Nations mission in Sudan. This was okay. Just a second. So Sudan has been at internal war for the last, ever since its independence, basically in the 1950s. Apart from a few years of peace now and then, effectively it's been an internal war. But in 2003, there was this prospect of peace because John Garang's SPLM in the south and the Khartoum Islamist regime in Khartoum, Bashir, had fought each other to a standstill. And the prospect for that we would have peace in this country, Africa's largest at that time, which had the world's longest running conflict, Africa's longest running conflict, that had resulted in the world's largest numbers of refugees and displaced at that time. And I was appointed to this position, and there's a reason why I was appointed to that position. Firstly, I don't look like this guy. In other words, I'm not black. Secondly, I don't look like her. I'm not white. And therefore, I'm not touched by Western imperialism and such like as you are. I'm not Arab looking, which was basically the chief identity in the north. So I wasn't Arab, I wasn't black, and I wasn't white. I was Asian. So, and as you know, Asia is the future, so we believe. Here in Vancouver, you're very close to Asia, you might as well start kind of joining up. So at that moment, so I was appointed the head of the UN, in a sense as a person who was neutral for the job, who was not belonging to any group or faction. I came from outside the UN system. So the internal UN tribes were fighting each other, different agencies, etc. So yes, the UN is full of tribes as well, and we can talk about that. And so I thought I would be presiding over bringing peace to this troubled land, and you know, and hence play a role in history. But soon after I arrived in early April 2003, a little conflict broke out, and we got news about something that was happening in a faraway place called Darfur. People hardly knew what it was. It's about 1,000 kilometers, 1,500 kilometers to the west of Khartoum. Hardly anybody knows what goes on there. It's a faraway place. And vast area, the size of France, they say. Vast area, the size of France. Have you noticed, by the way, that when everyone talks about Darfur, they talk about Darfur being the size of France. But when you talk about France, nobody says, oh, France is a big country in Europe, the size of Darfur. It just shows, you know, what mindsets we have, the way we think of the world. Anyway, that's another story. So then, as the head of the UN, I began my investigation of what was going on in Darfur. And that meant trying to get some staff in, but of course the Sudanese government of Bashir obstructed all the time. And then I flew over into Darfur, and over Darfur, I was the head of, at that time, the UN's biggest operation in the world. We had thousands of staff, scores of aircraft, and a budget of several $100 million. So we had a lot of assets at our control. And I went to look at what was going on in Darfur, and it became clear that something very special was happening there. This wasn't just another conflict in a part of Sudan which was full of conflicts, or Africa, which was full of conflicts, but there were special features for it. So when you flew over Darfur in the middle of 2003, you would see a village burning here, and a few seconds flying time away, another village which was completely intact, then another village which was burning, another village intact. And on one of my trips, I even saw the Janjaweed, men, these are kind of paramilitary soldiers, but the Janjaweed, they're just men on horseback or camels, riding into villages, carrying AK-47s, rushing into a village which had been bombed by these Antonovs. Antonovs are Russian cargo planes, they're not bombers. But what the Sudanese regime has done is converted these Antonovs into bombers by basically making handmade bombs, like in oil drums and filling them with oil and rubbish. And then you open the cargo plane at the back and you roll these bombs down onto these villages, and then they just burst into flames. And then when everyone runs out, the Janjaweed used to come rushing in on the camels and horseback, and I was there, I even saw this myself with my own eyes. And as always, the men rushed off fast into the distance because they're stronger. The women's natural tendency is to look for the children, so they got delayed. And then the Janjaweed would come and gather all these women and children, put them on their horses, and take them away. And then the women were not always killed. Most were not killed. They were raped. More than 2 out of 3 women in Darfur have been raped. But they would be sent back to the communities so that there could be a living testimony to the insult, if you like, to the Darfuri community. So now it's a region the size of France. And this was going on all over Darfur. So this information we picked up. Now I'm going to ask you, to put yourself in my position as the head of the United Nations system in Sudan, based in Khartoum, but traveling everywhere with all the resources and staff and position and privilege that you had. Imagine yourself as me. And you're getting this information about what's going on in Darfur as I've just described it, in much greater detail than I have described it. What would you do if you were the UN chief in Khartoum at that time? Anyone? No Sudanese are allowed to answer. This is for others. Anyone? Please speak. Even as you said nothing, another 3 villages have got burnt.
Ask for help. Ask someone for help.
What do you mean, ask for help? What, jump up and down and say, help, 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 send the fire brigade?
Or use a phone or something.
Phone a friend?
Yeah.
No, go on. Serious, I'm pulling your leg, but go on. What would you do?
I don't know what type of authority you would have in your position, but I would think that you would need to ask someone if you could do something about that specifically. You could respond to something like that. So if you needed to ask for permission to do something about it, and then try and go do it.
Okay. So I ask someone to do something. Okay.
Or if you're allowed to do something.
Right. Anyone else? Any offers?
I mean, I don't have a clue, but you have to get to the source of the problem, and if the source of the problem is not cleaning up after, I mean, certainly it's...
Okay, so you investigate the problem. All right.
Like you, and it's got to be a political solution or military or something like to stop the
Okay.
bombing, something.
Stick to your first point. You have to get to the source of the problem. So for that, you need to investigate. Yeah? You need to find out your facts. You get your facts. So a region the size of France being bombed by Antonovs, helicopter gunships you see yourself in Al Fashar airport, as I saw for myself. Refugees streaming into neighboring Chad and Central African Republic from in the tens of thousands, from which you can get their statement. People turning up in Khartoum and setting up in the camps around Khartoum, and you can get their stories from them. So you begin to understand that this is a massive operation going on, targeted only against tribes of black African origin by the Janjaweed, which are basically Arab. It's not a religious war. Both sides are Muslim, so it's not a religious war. So you made all these investigations, and you got all this information, even more. What do you do?
Well, the source of the problem, who's causing it? If it's the government, you've got to...
Well, only the government would have aircraft. Only the government would have helicopter gunships. The rebels don't have that. So that's the source of the problem. Only they have the ability to organize a campaign across a region the size of France. No group of bandits or rebel groups would organize that. This is an organized attempt across a region the size of France.
Bring international pressure, try to bring international pressure against the government.
So yeah, but you've been too academic. Imagine yourself in my position. You can't kind of sit there at your desk and say, I must bring I must bring international pressure. What do you do? What do you do?
You have to take care of those refugees. You have to get humanitarian aid to the refugees first. Then when they're taken care of, then you can start thinking about sending military aid or political pressure or anything. Because it doesn't look good for the UN if you're sitting here writing papers when that's going on. You need to send some. So
refer to the Security Council.
Refer to Security Council. You're going too fast. You're kind of your responses sound as if they're out of a master's course in international relations. Get real people. Sorry if I'm a little bit harsh on you, but I want you to step out of your comfort zone here. Your academic, intellectual base.
You have gunships?
I don't have gunships. Unfortunately, I wish I did, but I wish I had then. Even now, I wish I had. But there we go.
Can you create an aura that tells the government that UN is going to come at you the same way you're coming at these people?
Do you know anything about the UN?
enough to think that they have military power if they
Let
really
me put you
want
out
to.
of your misery. Or you put me out of my misery. I mean, you're right, you do humanitarian aid, we'll come to that in a minute. The first thing you do, obviously, as the head of the UN, the senior kind of diplomat there, you talk to your government, you talk to Bashir, you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you go to the President's office, and you say, I'm hearing these reports about these terrible things going on in Darfur. Mr. Foreign Minister, what's going on? And what do you think was the response from the Sudan government after I'd been to talk to my counterparts within the Khartoum regime?
They deny.
Yeah, so what did they say? I mean, yeah, they denied, but that's the academic term. What do you think? Imagine yourself, the foreign minister of Khartoum. No, please put yourself in your position. Before you leave this room, I'm going to make sure you feel every pain that we went through, you see. So here you are, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sudan. What's his name? My good friend. At that time. Mustafa, with whom I've had many arguments before and since. So he says, sit down, Your Excellency, because you're a diplomat, you call each other such useless titles. Have a glass of tea, some dates, some kerkede perhaps, which is a very sweet drink, which is very traditional. I'm a diabetic, and it was always a great problem for me, drinking this kerkede, because for me a glass of kerkede was like a death sentence, if you like. It took me a long time to educate me, I can't drink sweet things, but anyway, side story. So these are just a bunch of thugs, bunch of bandits, and don't worry, Mr. UN, we'll get the situation under control. So you say, the bunch of thugs, do they have the capacity to launch a campaign all over Darfur, the size of France? Well, since when did the rebels forces have helicopter gunships and Antonovs at their disposal? Clearly, the denial wasn't just denial, it was brazen-faced lies. So then what do you do?
Get evidence.
You're getting the evidence all the time. People are bringing reports, you're traveling there, etc., etc. Evidence is accumulating. Even as we speak, in the last 2 minutes, another 10 villages have been destroyed.
Media?
Yeah, but that's much later. Do you start out with the media? I mean, you don't, you're sitting at your desk, you don't sort of bring up and say, I want to speak to the CBC. Go on.
You have to play the game.
So what? You have to play the game. So what's the next stage of the game?
The next stage would be how can we work together to support your efforts? So you placate the government in their position and saying, well, you're really here to help them too. And how can we work together to do that?
Is that what we did with Hitler? We did. We tried to play the game with Hitler for, I think, about a year or so. And then he walked into, was it Czechoslovakia first, then Poland, and then the game went on to a different level.
Yeah,
but is this what you do? See, I want you to get to this. Is this what you do? You're playing the game. Meanwhile, stories are coming to you of women being raped on an industrial scale. And I mean industrial scale. When I mean industrial scale, I mean women being lined up, gang raped in front of their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, their children, systematically by Janjaweed and Sudanese army officials wearing Sudanese army uniforms with trucks to carry away the raped women if they were lucky. And if they're unlucky, they're just left lying around. What game would you like to play? It's a game of life and death. So would you sit in your office, air-conditioned of course, big thick bulletproof windows? It was only a little bit before your friend Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was a good friend of mine, got blasted in Baghdad, where I would have also died if I'd accepted the UN's offer to go with him to be in Baghdad. So you play the game. What do you do next?
Document, media document.
Sorry?
Video document.
There's no access, there's no media, there's no journalists, there's nothing. So the next thing you do, obviously you're not playing the right game as a diplomat, but the right game to play as a diplomat is you've already spoken to your government. So next chapter in the game is to speak to fellow diplomats. So you go off to the British embassy. I was a senior British government official on secondment to UN, so I knew them quite well. You go to the French embassy, you go to the Dutch ambassador, you speak to the Canadian chargé. The Canadian ambassador was sitting comfortably in Cairo, but he had an office there. and a few other embassies. So you speak to your fellow diplomats and say, hey, I'm hearing these things are going on. And what do you think this diplomat said?
Not our problem.
Sorry?
It's not our problem.
Actually, that could have been a response, but as it turned out, they didn't say that. Because, you know, diplomats are diplomats. They would not quite say that. I mean, that would be too honest, you know. Remember we're playing diplomacy here? It's a game, and honesty is not part of it. So I don't think you'd be a very good player on this game. Right. So what do? So a diplomat says, oh, this is terrible. Yes, we are hearing these stories too. By the way, have another cup of tea. We'll send our reports. We'll send your reports to London, Paris, Ottawa, Washington, wherever else you like. We'll hear what capitals say. So, you know. Okay, so this happens. Then what's almost the first thing you do, even before all of this? Remember who you're employed by?
The UN.
So what do? You write a report. So remember, one thing bureaucrats are pretty good at? And one important part of game playing is writing memos. You know? See, now you're playing the game. Now you're getting the idea. So you write your reports. Dear Kofi Annan, you know, good. Hope you had a nice sleep. And you know, so you write your memos to your bosses at headquarters. I reported to several bosses. That's another part of the bureaucratic system. You kind of fudge who is actually responsible. What do you think was the reaction from the UN headquarters in New York? Sorry?
Saying this is terrible.
Some what, sir? Yeah. No. What did they say? What did New York say?
Well, they probably condemn it, right? If they have enough evidence, they're going to condemn it.
Okay. If you go to my website, which is just my name, mukeshkabla.org, on the front cover, where the book is promoted, underneath there somewhere, there is a little tab which says my archives, which I released all my correspondence from 2003 to 2004. It might be worth something to do on a rainy Vancouver evening. You've got nothing better to do. And there's something you will notice. It's a very one-sided conversation. It's got all my memos, my reports, my correspondence with the Sudan government as well as the UN, and so it's all on there. Anyway, all that I could carry away on my laptop when I was forced to leave a year later. Not everything is there, but only what I could say, retrieve. There's no other stuff on it. Not because I'm reticent in putting it there, but because there was no response. Silence. And as we will discover later on, silence kills. So here's the situation. So people are not responding to your emails. I mean, poor old General Delaire's time, that great Canadian whose country we are in now, 10 years ago, 10 years before that, he had cables. He sent telexes. Remember telexes? Faxes? Probably some of you still send faxes. You know, I had emails. He had telexes and faxes and cables. Darfur is the first genocide of the global technology and global media age. So poor Delaire had to rely on old-fashioned techniques. I don't even know whether they had computers or what kind of computers they had in 1994 in Rwanda. But in my time, we had all the stuff that you have now, more or less. So in other words, the difference between Rwanda 94 and Darfur 2004 was that in one case, terrible things happened in the middle of somewhere and gradually pieced out, and Dallaire fed a lot of information back to UN and went into a black hole, nothing came back. In my case, I had much easier access to technology. I could just go onto my laptop and send off messages to everyone. And with email technology, if the message doesn't get delivered, you get a response back, message not delivered. Yeah? So I knew the messages were being delivered. And because we were in the email age, you copy to 5 different people. So at least some of those messages will be delivered to someone. In other words, one of the excuses that we normally have why these things happen, i.e. we did not know, was not true. The second excuse that wasn't true was policymakers not knowing about it. You know, there are two separate reasons here. I mean, information is available. Never before have we known so much, recorded so much, witnessed so much, photographed so much, taken evidence so much, even as a horror story was unfolding, unlike in other previous situations. Also, never before have we had access to highest levels as we did. Why? Because I was a senior government official of the British government on secondment to the UN. I knew all the players. So when I came to Washington, I met in the National Security Council. When I went to London, I went with my ministers. When I went to Oslo, Paris, etc., I was received at the highest levels. So access wasn't a problem, for us. I wasn't a junior official. I was the head of the United Nations system in Sudan. So, my dear friends, that's the background. So, nothing happened. Now, when your emails and letters didn't get replied to, what would you have done? What did you do next? Remember, you're still doing my job?
Find a Hollywood movie star to promote the cause.
Would what?
Find a Hollywood movie star to actually make it mainstream media.
You're going too fast. Before you get there, what do you do?
You either phone or go in person to...
Go in person. So, okay. So, they weren't replying to my letters, so I hop on the plane, and say, and come to New York and say, hi folks, remember me? I'm the UN guy in Khartoum. Did you get my message? Oh yes, we did get your message, but kind of, we're busy. So you go to London, you go to Paris. Do you remember me? Hello? Anyone there? So have a nice day. So you do that. The next stage is diplomacy. After you've done your local work, you're communicated to through international diplomats. You then go to the next stage and you make your personal diplomatic rounds to the important capitals. In my case, the Security Council countries. Sudan, which had had a conflict for the last almost as long as the UN has been around, had never been discussed in the UN Security Council, at least in living memory. So what do you think was the reaction I got when I personally appeared and knocked on the doors in London, New York, Washington, Paris, Oslo? In fact, I was known as the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator, the UN chief outside Sudan than inside, because I spent so much of my time traveling to try and actually get people interested in what was going on in Darfur. What do you think was the reaction when I was face to face with senior people?
Oh yeah, we know it's been happening for 50 years.
So they said, we know what's happening. In fact, in some places which were friendly, I even saw intelligence information which showed that the great powers knew a great deal of what was going on. But the reaction was that we could not, remember Iraq war was happening at the same time, 2003, trying to kick out Assad, not Assad, Saddam. And so, sorry, we're busy on that front. We don't want to annoy, open up another front. Also, the alibi given was that because there's a peace process going on between Khartoum and the south, and the idea was that those peace talks would eventually be successful, and then when they were successful, there would be milk and honey flowing in the land, and the lion and the lamb would lie together and make peace. And Darfur's problem would be sorted out at the same time. So the idea was to let the people of Darfur continue to suffer while the peace process between the north and the south was sorted out. Even though Garang had told me personally, when I had my discussions with him, that he wasn't going to sign the peace process, the document, too quickly, because he was afraid that he would then become part of the Khartoum regime. He would become the vice president, and then he would be responsible, if you like, for the Darfur situation. And as everyone knew, as he told me, the real power was not with the civilian parts of the regime, it was with the military part. Yeah. So, and I paid a visit to President Bashir's office, where I met with a very senior person, and when I was protesting about what was going on in Darfur, and this guy looked at me and said, "We will sign the peace, Navasha peace document, the big peace process, when they had completed the final solution in Darfur." Now, do you know your history? Do you know your history about what that means? Those of you who are not of European origin, Canadians of non-European origin, do you know what final solution means?
Yes. That means ethnic cleansing typically, right?
Yeah, but this is what Hitler said basically. When the various conflict, when the genocide was going on in Europe, in Germany, and his policy against the Jews was the final solution. To get rid of the world of all Jews. So a senior official says next to me, yes, we will sign the peace once we have had the final solution in Darfur, admitting that they were committing genocide. So then what do? You are the UN. What do you do? So you've been to New York, you've been to London, you've been to all these places, you've collected all the evidence, you got everything recorded, photographed, etc. What do you do? What's next?
Can you set up protected zones?
Who?
Can you protect certain regions?
Well,
Like,
what do you think? What do you think is at my disposal?
Did you suggest to them, this is what I think we should do?
Sure. Well, you have to. Sure. What do you think I suggested?
I don't know.
Does that wording though, that revelation later on in the process, does that being distributed among the UN ranks change the game at all?
No.
The wording?
Nothing changed the game.
Nothing.
So you can't ask for protection zones when everyone's saying we don't want to do anything.
The information needs to get out now globally.
So information needs to get out. So if you won't speak to the world's if the world's governments won't listen to you, I decided I would speak to the world's peoples. And that's when I went to the media that you wanted me to go to on day one. And I spoke on the BBC in March 2004, and then from that, and I did it at a time in Nairobi when New York would be asleep. So Kofi Annan was probably tucked up in his pajamas next to his teddy bear, having a sound sleep. And because 7 hours time zone difference between Nairobi and New York. So on one morning I gave a press interview and said three things. One, that the situation in Sudan, in Darfur, was the world's biggest humanitarian crisis at that time, which it was. Secondly, it was a human rights catastrophe on a par with Rwanda. Because 2004 was the 10th anniversary of Rwanda. Yeah? And the only difference between Rwanda and Darfur being the numbers involved, not the intent, not the nature. And third thing I said, which was the kind of nuclear option, was that the government of Sudan, my host government, was responsible for committing these mass atrocities. I didn't use the word genocide, but I used the word ethnic cleansing. So what do you think happened next?
Sorry, why didn't you use that language of genocide? What was your...
What's the difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide?
Well, one, for international law, what would then cause certain action to take place according to the Genocide Convention.
Yeah.
So was that your reasoning for
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think your question is spot on. I think for me, the word genocide should be used more after a proper legal investigation has taken place. And a duly constituted authority should say, this is what happened with the International Criminal Court, the inquiry, the Security Council Committee, which then did, and then the indictment against Bashir, which is for many crimes. It includes also crimes against humanity. Okay? So, what happened?
Was that the end of your career at the UN?
So that was one thing. It's the end of my career at the UN. It was almost the end of my life because there was jihad and calls against, threats against me and all that. And I left. But we'll come back to that in the discussion, what happened to me. I'm still here talking to you. What else happened?
The UN then has to respond.
So what happened was that the UN moved fastest it has ever done since its creation. So 3 weeks before, I've been in New York, and I said, please, can we discuss a matter in the Security Council? And everyone said no. Then when it hit the media and it became worldwide news, overnight it became worldwide news. Then within 3 weeks, there was a presidential statement, a Security Council resolution, and within 3 months, there were peacekeepers on the ground. Too little, too late, because the ethnic cleansing, or genocide, as you may call it, was done and finished. So, I want to stop there because there are lessons I want to draw out, but I'd rather do that in the discussion, in a way. But there is one lesson I want to draw out right now, and that is that it's not what you say, but the platform from which you say that makes the difference. So if you're taking a monkey, put a label in front of it saying UN Chief of Sudan, put a microchip in the monkey's head so he could speak human language, and you could teach him what I said on the media in mid-March 2004, that would have made the news. The point is, this is not a story about me. This is, I could be a monkey. It's a story about the office. Anyone who occupied that office with the label in front of it saying United Nations, embodying into that office all the norms, values, responsibilities, and trusts and aspirations of a world public, was what made it news, in a sense. It is not who you are, but the position you occupy. It is not what you say, but the platform from which you say it. That can make a difference. So imagine if someone in a higher platform, Kofi Annan, for example, or a world leader, maybe has said these things 3 or 4 months earlier, as I was trying to get them to say. Could we have made a difference? Could we have prevented what's going on? Probably not prevented, but certainly reduced. So you see, the first genocide of the media age, successful. Also, this is the world's most successful genocide, because even the Holocaust in the Second World War lasted only 6 years, even though millions died. Even the Rwanda killings happened over 100 days. But the genocide in Darfur has not only continued for 10 years to this very day, it still goes on, the atrocities, though the scope has changed. But it's been extended to the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile, and that was a video I showed to you earlier on for my trip earlier this year. The world's most successful genocide. If you look at the history of genocide over the last 7,000 years that historians have been studying it, there are no incidents in history, apart from, I am told, the destruction of the First Nations people in North America in certain areas who were totally exterminated. I understand, but it's very complicated tribal structure in Canada at that time, you see it. So, but generally speaking, there is nowhere in history. Mostly things last for a year or two and then it's finished. Somebody reverses it or something happens. This is the world's most successful genocide. It carries on to this day. And I've taken you through, in concluding, and then I hope we can have some good discussion because there are other points I want to bring out in the discussion. But what I hope I've taken you through is not an academic process of describing things, but I've asked you to travel with me and be with me along this journey of failure. So thank you. Yeah.
I have a question. If you were to do it again, would you do it the same way? Would you do anything differently?
Yes, I would probably speak up earlier. I would play the game. I would not play the game for so long. It's possibly if I spoken out earlier, but you can't speak earlier. I could have spoken earlier because you needed the evidence in your hands. You can't suddenly say, oh, Bashir is a genocide without kind of getting your cast iron evidence, and that takes time. Especially as you were excluded from Darfur for long periods of time, because the government excluded humanitarian aid, and as it said in the film, it's denying humanitarian aid in the Nuba Mountains, which is a crime against humanity. The same things happen. So yeah, I could have done things better and stronger and earlier, but there we are. Go ahead.
In the video, they mentioned that there are misconceived policies by major powers. Could you elaborate on?
Yeah, very good question. I was hoping someone would ask that. You see, what's going on at the moment is that there's a lot of pressure, including from the US, Europe, and so on, to bring the two sides, the SPLM, SRF grouping, the rebel grouping on one side, and the Bashir regime on the other side, to the table for talks. And this is going on under the auspices of the African Union. And they're being pressurized in all this. So as that woman who was talking about rape on the film said to me, you're asking us to make peace with this person who's raped us, who's raped my sisters, my daughters, who's abused my father, burnt our lands, we live in caves like animals, and you're asking us to make peace with him? You didn't do that with Hitler, you didn't do that with Pol Pot, you didn't do that with Idi Amin in the end. You know, got a lesson from history, a learning point here for those who wish to learn anything. No genocidal dictator has ever been removed from power, ever in world history, anywhere in the world, since time began, without the use of force. Ever. I'm not talking about small wars and dictatorships here, I'm talking about the special case of crimes against humanity. It took the whole world war to get rid of Hitler. It took the Vietnamese to get rid of Pol Pot. It took the Tanzanians to get rid of Idi Amin. It took Kagame to march in from Uganda to get rid of the Rwanda. What do you think is going to be different in Sudan? So my point here is, and here is a kind of message for peace geeks and others, is also, we can debate a bit about violence and non-violence, so I'm not a violent person, I would rather not be having violence. But one has to say that history is not on our side when it comes to the special case of genocidal dictators.
I'm sensing, or I'm starting to sense or see that this is going to be a huge conflict between having information and not having information. When we were talking about how in ways we can use technology, and how, I'm in education and I work with teachers in Africa, and my piece is on how to connect children globally to share these stories and hear these stories and understand these stories. The technology has always been there. The technology is there to do that, yet the policy is not. And when we start looking at, especially when we're looking at like what major corporations are doing and are quiet about it, and things keep happening. We know these things are happening, yet it keeps happening until something major happens, and we all hear about it. So it's always seems to be like now there's going to be a conflict between how we can keep certain things quiet for those to benefit from, as opposed to others who say, how do we get this information out there? For you, like how do we get, the piece is now, how do we fight this information conflict?
Well, let's go back. A little bit of history lesson here for ourselves. I mean, this is not me preaching to you, we're discovering these things together. 150 years ago, approximately, the man called Henry Dunant, Swiss man, went onto the battlefield of Solferino, which is a battlefield in northern Italy, where I think it was the French or Austrians fighting each other or something. And he marched into the middle of the battlefield with bullets flying overhead, and he got a bed sheet from his bed, and on that he painted a red cross. The red cross is the opposite of the Swiss flag. That's why it's a red cross, okay? And he said, and bullets were flying, and he said, soldiers have fallen, they're no longer fighting, and he started dragging them away. And the villagers around him in this northern Italian town then came out of their homes, ordinary civilians, risking their lives, and started helping him, carrying his soldiers onto their homes, giving them, bread and wine, whatever else, mopping their brows, etc., right? Now, my point here is to illustrate only one issue here, and that is about courage. These people risk their lives, but above all else, it's not a question of risking lives. That's the easiest thing to risk, your life. Plenty of examples of that. But what's much more courageous thing to do is to challenge established ideas and establish orthodoxy. And you're a teacher. If you're not doing that in your work, then you're failing in your job. So the question for us is, we live in a world where every single global institution charged with the protection of people is failing us. International peacekeeping has failed us in Rwanda, in Darfur, where we had UN peacekeepers, African Union peacekeepers, but of course they've been alibi for ongoing violence. You know the situation in Syria and elsewhere. Okay. So then, the courage to change thinking, to think of something else, is what's needed, not a question of the status quo. My point is, if you come back to the Red Cross of today compared to the Red Cross of 150 years ago, you see the ideas I developed. The Red Cross does a wonderful job. I worked for the Red Cross for many years in a senior position. But I sometimes wonder whether the notions of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality, some of the humanitarian principles, have become alibis for actually inaction. So, you know, it's a difference between if, for example, there was a big hole in the road outside and citizens kept on tripping down that hole. And if you're a humanitarian, you would put a first aid post beside it, you would put an ambulance there, and you would take people to the hospital when they've broken their bones. Yeah? But if you said, hey, why is there a hole in the road? Let's agitate and organize and fill the hole in the road so people don't fall into the hole in the road. Do you see the point? But we are at that stage, if you like, of losing our courage. Similarly with the UN. So it's a question of courage. Then it's a question of leadership and accountability. So you commit. So Kofi Annan, and this is not an anti-UN, on the contrary, my message is a very positive, multilateral, international positive one. But it is about individual accountability. Kofi Annan was the head of peacekeeping during the Rwanda times. Delay reported to him. And his message got nowhere. You'll know this from history. He was also the head of peacekeeping during Srebrenica. And now he was a big boss, head of the UN. You know. So we have 3 genocides under the tutelage of one leader. And then we give such a leader the Nobel Prize for peace. Are you surprised that atrocities like this will happen again and again and again, when not only do you get away scot-free from mass murder? I'm not talking about Kofi Annan as a mass murderer, but the point I'm trying to make is that those who stand by and do nothing are almost as culpable as those who pull the trigger or shove the knife in your back, in a way. So the message, if there is one, is that unless we have individual accountability of decision makers, there is no incentive for institutional development and change. If, for example, you know, when I was in the British government, I used to make policy. I used to sit on my desk, depending on the mood I was in, I would take a position. And if it appears the British government thinks ABC, well, British government is just nobody. But individuals like me who happen to think. Similarly, what is Ottawa's policy on this? You know, it's not Ottawa. It is the individual, foreign minister or senior official, this, that, and the other. My point is that we have to recapture the global system for that. The opening words of the UN Charter say, we the peoples. Unfortunately, as you go higher up the institutional scale, and you get higher and higher up, and leaders rise to the top, so you're on the 38th floor of the UN, which is the highest level, and oxygen is more rarefied there, perhaps. You know. The more separated you get from we the peoples on the pavement, or the sidewalk, as you say in North America. So, the point here I'm trying to make is that think as citizens, as democrats, to how to recapture the global institution, hold cowardly leaders to account. Because if we don't do that, these things will happen again and again and again. Long answer to your question.
Just wondered, what do you think? You talked about violence being the only way to essentially get rid of a leader who's committed genocide. I wonder what you feel the impact is of the special prosecutor, or the senior prosecutor at the ICC, issuing warrants for the arrests of certain leaders, Bashir being one, and what kind of impact that has. I mean, obviously, Bashir has not been arrested in any country he's gone to, but do you think that that has an impact, positive or negative, on perception, on bringing it to light, or on people's reactions or actions? Or inaction?
2 points there. Let me take the last one quickly. I think it's a great thing he got indicted. Some people say, for example, oh, it's complicated the process, you know, because clearly, people want a negotiated peace. In the end, of course, with or without violence along the way, you will have to come to a political solution, right? We all agree on this. This is also what history teaches you. And the apologists argue that by indicting Bashir, you are interfering with that. You're making it harder to come to a political solution, because obviously Bashir isn't going to be happy, is he? But then we have to look at history again. No peace agreement in history, anywhere, has ever worked without a justice and accountability track. In Sierra Leone, I dealt with for many years, I described that in the book, there were 17 peace agreements, and they all failed. In Central America, in your backyards, you will know the history of the 70s and 80s. And even now, what is the court that convicted the president of Guatemala, was it, Honduras? Yeah, okay. So the point is, history teaches us that you cannot make peace, you can make peace. You cannot sustain peace without justice and accountability. And so the ICC is the greatest thing that happened. And if domestic courts can't look after, then we need the International Criminal Court. So I think it's a good track. Clearly, he's not been indicted. But that, I wonder in Vancouver how many indictments are there against murderers, people who commit crimes, etc. And just because a criminal hasn't been arrested, you don't say, oh well, there's no point in bringing a case against alleged killer of murder on the street. Justice must happen. It'll take time. I think on your first part, which is a very interesting debate, especially I'm conscious here of my hosts and here. I want to make sure I'm not misunderstood. I'm not in favor of violence. I come from India, a Gandhian nation, and Gandhi showed, for example, what can be done through non-violence. You get rid of empires through non-violence, right? I would rather we had a non-violent approach, but I know that the weight of history is against us. In this special case, I'm not talking about ordinary conflicts or ordinary violence. I'm talking about the special case of mass atrocity, genocide committing leaders. So don't take these remarks as applying generally. It's only to the special case. So I would say that sooner or later we will have to remove Bashir. But I'm not saying that we should rush in with UN troops or anyone. But what I should say is, if the most fundamental of human rights is the right to live, then we should not stand in the way of the Sudanese themselves, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, North, or the SRF, or the other armed groups, if they take up arms with the intent to remove a dictator. If we cannot protect the woman who was raped and shown on that film with her permission, then I don't have the right to stop the people of that region to protect themselves, to defend themselves. It's most fundamental of human rights is the right to live. So the issue of violence is nuanced, if you like.
It's like it's a complicated issue, right? Because the UN recognizes the sovereignty of each nation, but when the government of a nation is obviously killing off its own people, it's like a schoolyard bully, who's terrorizing kids in the schoolyard. What do you do? Say, oh, let's have a little chat.
Well, I think the notion of state sovereignty is now changing. Everything evolves. A state that parasitizes on its own citizens, eats them, literally, almost, then that state has lost its legitimacy. See, and you have a distribution between the state of Sudan and the government of Sudan. So there is state sovereignty, but not necessarily government sovereignty. We recognize the borders of Sudan and we wish Sudan well, but the government of Sudan is an illegitimate regime. In the same way, there's a difference between Hitler and Germany. You respect the sovereignty of Germany, but you don't respect the sovereignty of the government, of the Nazi government of Germany. And people are confusing this. I think there's a lady there who wanted to make a comment. Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for your point about the importance of looking beyond preconceived notions and ideas and habits. And I wanted to have your comment on Aung San Suu Kyi's thought about the violence that's happening in Burma, and how she says that we must look beyond statistics, of what's happening and the number of victims will not help us in order to be able to bring about a peaceful future. We must instead look at the reasons why violence is committed in the first place, a message that she has been speaking for 20 years.
You're talking about Rohingyas, or you're talking about?
I'm talking about violence in general, and that was, not just the situation there.
Here, Aung San Suu Kyi, who I respect highly, and she's an icon for the world and so on. We part company on a number of aspects of what she's not doing now. When she was silent, she couldn't speak for herself, locked up in her little house in Rangoon. And I remember even trying to visit there as part of British government delegation. We kept waiting, we never met her, decided to meet her. At that time, I was a senior official in London. The world spoke for her when she was voiceless. And since she has now, she's able to speak for herself, the regret is that she does not raise her voice.
Okay, could I comment on that? Because I happen to be friends with somebody who co-wrote the book with her. His name is Alan Clements, and he has visited Burma again and knows the situation very well, has interviewed 120 political prisoners, and so knows the situation. He's also visited sites where atrocities have happened against Rohingyas. So it's not, just an outside perspective here. So if I may comment on that in particular, Aung San Suu Kyi right now is in a very delicate and very unique position of trying to ensure lasting peace by not having a situation of us versus them, and by not pointing out that we, such and such a person is evil, such and such a group is evil, but rather the root causes of violent action. We must look at that. We must also remember that soldiers are individuals that how they're recruited to join into armies, and so the root causes of evil, insecurity, fear, for example, and that's where I'm wondering you might be able to go.
I don't agree with that. I completely don't agree with that. I think it is possible to understand the context and the causes of evil and all that. No one is saying one shouldn't do that. No one is saying one should rush madly without any thinking into any situations. But I do know from my experience of 25 years of all the war zones and conflicts in the world, most of them, at least 95% have been there, that silence kills. When she doesn't speak up for the Rohingya.
No, she has. She has actually spoken about them.
Okay, we don't want to.
Way beyond now, and the regime has now used her to now have the popularity.
Okay, well, I must say I disagree because the way it looks, and is how you speak, and also the point is she's in a delicate position, but by definition, people who are suffering most are even more of a delicate position. See,
she has pointed out about the living situation.
Okay,
and
all right. Well, we don't want to kind of get the.
What I'm saying is for 20 years, and the world never responded to that until now. They're now actually looking to find weaknesses where there are none. She has spoken out. She's even spoken out in San Francisco about that. But it doesn't make for a very.
Okay, I want to just make the general point. Let's not get distracted by that. But I respect her entirely. But I tell you what my belief is, and that is one should always speak up. One should always speak up on behalf of the most vulnerable and the most tortured, the most suffering. And one must do that regardless of the consequences. One must do that regardless of sensitivities, because too often lives are lost for that particular reason.
I wanted to ask you to say a few more things about sovereignty. So you were just speaking on this changing definition of sovereignty, and the state might have not so inviolable borders anymore, the difference between the state as government and the state as the land. And so responsibility to protect is the technically adopted UN doctrine around if a state is no longer protecting its citizens, the UN has the right and the obligation even, and the International Treaty has the obligation to go
only we can say.
But it's not happening.
Yeah.
So what do you think has to change?
Well, throw away the responsibility to protect. I think I call R2P the responsibility to procrastinate, because there has not been a single major example of R2P success. I know it's a Canadian co-invention, and I think the concept is a noble one. But it is better to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you, people of the Nuba Mountains. Look after yourself. Take up arms, hide in the caves, look after yourself. I can't help you. It's far better for me to say that to these people than to pretend to protect. Because what that does is, that gives people a false sense of security, and then they are worse off. This is what happened in Rwanda. If you talk to Delay, you understand what happened. Everyone thought that the UN would protect. See, but the UN walked away for reasons, you know how that all happened. So I would say, this is never going to work. The way you're going to actually deal with this is not through UN peacekeepers, but through supporting local capacities for peace, which I think many of your organizations are doing, and building local capacities, and where necessary and where legitimate, armed opposition in extreme circumstances. Forget the UN peacekeeping efforts. It's not work. I know we're finishing soon, so but, it's up to you.
What do you think? Do you think that the UN has improved their learning on how to respond effectively? Do you think they've done what lessons, if any, do you think they've learned on how to empower civil society organizations to act and respond, or has it changed?
I don't think the UN mindset is capable of empowerment. I mean, it's asking too much. And by the way, I'm very passionately in favor of the UN. Nothing I say should be taken as anti-UN. If the UN didn't exist, we would be making it up now. But you have to ask the right organization for the right job. You can't ask the UN, which is a large, inefficient, global organization, more and more detached from the grassroots, whose governance is to a group of officials elected from that come from different countries. I mean, here you can throw out your government. But in the UN, it is the executive arm of government that represents the governments, not the parliament. There is no UN parliament. There is no connection with the people. So you're an unaccountable global bureaucratic organization. How can you ask it to empower anybody? So I think it's completely the wrong thing. I think citizens, this is what I mean, you have to think outside the box and stop asking an organization, beating a very half-dead organization to do something that it cannot do. We need a new forms of social mobilization, a new forms of democracy, and a new way of reclaiming these global organizations for ourselves. Now, how to do that will take more than 5 minutes. Maybe a few quick remarks before we finish, because I know you're wanting to finish. Yeah, please.
Thank you, first of all, for you taking this responsibility. I think this is my first time to hear someone, or face-to-face someone who's speaking about my views. And it has been over 20 years since Nuba Mountain has been going through this, but nobody ever talked about it or recognized it because of war. That's why we're here. If it wasn't because of that. But at that time of 1983 and up, they were under South Sudan, or they were just whatever reported, it was under South Sudan. In 1989 up to 2001, when they signed the ceasefire in Command, that time it was worse than what we're talking about today. But nobody ever talked about it. And again, it is happening again this time, and nobody is talking about that, even though they know it, but they know. And my feeling is, what is behind that? Are we not human like Baghdad, or what happening in Kandahar, or what is all over the world? Whatever happens, it is right away on the media. But how about Nuba Mountains people? What is behind that? We want to know. We are not human beings.
Anyone answer this question? Because I don't know what the answer is. Other than to say that when the media would not come, I went and made my own movie, and it's been shown on CNN and BBC and all the rest of it, you see. So, anyone answer?
Well, I think part of the reason is the media itself, because we're currently we receive too much information from many other places in the world, and all those information has to be shocking enough to get people attention, and so we kind of desensitized to the news and to the pain of other people. So that's the reason why we think that the pain of people in Darfur is pretty much the same like the pain of people who in Thailand in the tsunami, they suffer all the same kind of things. So we kind of desensitize the pain because of information, the overload thing of information.
So then what's the answer?
Media has to pick stories that will make them money.
I mean, just look at it this way. You have a hospital here you have many hospitals in Vancouver. So a hospital in Vancouver is full of patients, heart attacks, strokes, cancers, child falls and lands on its head in the playground, etc., etc. Do you think that when these patients go to the hospital, doctor says, I'm very sorry, I'm sorry your head is broken, but I'm busy dealing with him, and I'll get to you. And meanwhile, you die. I mean, the hospital takes everyone, and then it has a system, and then it deals with them. And of course, there's a system of governance, you have an insurance system, you have a national health service, something, etc. So, but a hospital doesn't say, I'm sorry, my bank of suffering, my feeling of empathy is overburdened, and I'm sorry, this side cannot be treated anymore. We don't do that, do we? So we know that we are capable of forming institutions to run our affairs. Sure, the world is full of problems. Sure, the world is full of pain. Sure, there's suffering everywhere. But what you're saying is not an explanation. It's perhaps an alibi. What you're saying is correct, if you like. If you're saying it is correct, but many people think like you. But the problem is that you accept it.
So in the experiences you've had where you've been in these torn up countries, what makes people believe in governance again? Because that's the only time peace really happens, is when that belief happens, when they believe in safety.
I mean, no one yet has invented any better way of running a group's affairs other than some form of representation and leadership that comes from some form of representation, i.e. what we call democratic governance. Of course, some happens good or bad, and here what's happening in Canada, I'm told, is a very interesting experiment at the present time with your elected government, and that's for you Canadians to figure out and decide what to do, how the face of Canada is changing. But the point is, there is no shortcuts to that, So what I'm saying is that quick fixes don't work. What you have to do is work long term. So a gentleman who was talking about education, he was right. I mean, part of education, we have to do that. Capacity building, we have to do that. We have to ensure that we have some way of development, including economic and social development, which actually advances the agenda. And these are all long-term tasks, you see. But at the heart of this is also this issue of accountability. Just like a doctor who will confront with two patients, has to make a choice. And he can save him or he can save him. But he has system and rules in his head by which he decides to help him and not him, right? There's a system of accountability to make those decisions. What is lacking in our governance system is that accountability. So at a very simple level, that's what's lacking. So we have impunity. If you have a murder outside on the road, the law, you might get caught. But if you kill 1 million people, you'll get away scot-free. That's the irony of the situation we're in. And it's the same situation, because you have a law and order system, you have a justice system that does its best, doesn't it, to keep the citizens of Vancouver safe. It's not always very good, people complain about it, murderers on the street still, etc., but you have a system. Yeah, good or bad, it is. It's generally good.
How do people believe in the political system after such
an
corrupt period?
But they do. That, by the way, when I went to the Blue Nile, you know what they said to me? It was really sweet in a little meeting we had. They said, why isn't the president of the world listening to us? So I said, what? What's the president of the world? And they think the Secretary General of the UN is the president of the world. And he's very busy, that's why he's not listening to us. Once he listens to us, everything will be sorted out. People, you're right, people have faith. People have trust. Naively they have trust sometimes, if you like. But they're right to have that. The last thing we must do is to take away that faith, that trust, that hope, because then they have nothing. But for us, those of us who are, if you like, have the privileges that we have here, we must challenge to make sure that the trust is not abused, especially on behalf of the people who are unable to kind of reach the highest levels of being heard in a way. So I think the answer is what is good enough for Canada in its state formation over the last, 200 or 300 years is good enough for Sudan. It's a question of doing it, in a way. And but it also means that if you can't help them to do it, then don't stand in the way of doing it for themselves. This is my nuanced message about war and peace and so on. Please remember one thing in final conclusion, then I will really shut up. There's another lesson from history which is really rather kind of sad to internalize, and that is no human right in the world has ever been realized except through struggle. If you look at all the human rights that are listed in the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter of Human Rights and all that, every one of them, the right to free association, the right to vote as men and women, the right to talk to each other, practice our religions, etc. Any right you can think of, which we take for granted. If you go into the history of the human rights, every one of that right was fought over by somebody in some country. Then what happened is that right, once it had been won, spread to neighboring communities and regions and countries, and then became a global norm. And that's happened. So my point is, as someone once said, a right that has not been struggled over, including freedom, including the right for dignity, is probably a right not worth having. I don't go as far as that, but it makes you think a little bit about really, what the realities are that face the poor people of Sudan or other situations like in Syria and elsewhere. We could go on and on, but maybe last word there and then we'll shut up.
Yeah, I'm just trying to ask about what is your understanding between what took place when trouble happened in Libya and the rest of what you just outlined, the genocidal things that have taken place through the history. In case of Libya, people act very quickly, and it was in the same understanding of that they want to save human life. My simple understanding here is that whether the interest has something to do with the decision making.
Sorry, what self-interest?
Yeah.
Maybe, but what the self-interest is, I'm not sure. I don't know, I can't answer the question other than to say that the way the Western allies, NATO, went into Libya has caused a lot of problems subsequently. For example, currently in Syria, where we can't get international consensus on what to do. I think it is better to go in honestly if you're going to progress on a state, and not invent reasons like chemical weapons we invented in Iraq, which were never there. And it's good to get rid of the Iraqi dictatorship, but not on those grounds. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are inconsistencies in behavior. When we act in one country, another country, or that country, or that country, there have always been inconsistencies in response. And the search for international kind of consistency or rule of law is to move from ad hoc responses and self-interested responses, as you say, to one which are based on matters of principle or they're consistent. Some say that this is impossible, that actually politics is always inconsistent, and that ad hoc and pragmatic decisions are being made in all countries at all times, always have been, and thus it will continue. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. What I do know is that we stand at this moment in history where there is a lot at stake. Do we basically have a laissez-faire, pragmatic approach to issues? Sometimes we act, sometimes we don't act. Sometimes we make an excuse for acting and then go way beyond that, like in Libya. Sometimes we find reasons for inaction, as in Syria. See. So, is there a way that we might have a more consistent approach? Well, I don't think we will have a consistent approach if we rely entirely on our institutions, our global institutions. The only way I can think of is that if we can change mindsets in nations, at communities level. We're back to my central premise, the most difficult one of all, which is to increase the democratic governance of our global institutions and to reconnect those global institutions to ordinary people. Because one thing we can be sure is ordinary people, whether they're Canadians or Chinese, or Indians or Ethiopians, they actually more or less believe in the same things, in a way. So this is a really empowerment message for peace geeks, for development organizations, etc. Sometimes you may feel that your small work you're doing in little things here and there. I don't know whether you sometimes feel that it's worth it, whether you're actually making a difference. Whether I know you feel good about it, but is it worth it? I think your work is hugely important. It is from those little seeds and connecting them. And it doesn't matter whether there are only 40 people here and we're talking amongst ourselves. Another 40 people, another 40 people, and it can make a difference. So it's there at the grassroots that we have to bring about change on a global level. It can happen.
On that optimistic note, we really have to cut back.
Yes, the chairman.
But well, we're going to have a couple of more minutes to be here and mingle. So if that's possible, I know a lot of us have questions and comments in our chest. But before thanking our speaker, I would like to thank Lost and Found Cafe for providing us with the venue and with the snacks. I'd like to